The penthouse in the heart of the city was a masterpiece of glass and steel, yet it felt more like a tomb. Taeyang moved through the shadows of his living room with the silent, rhythmic precision of a predator who no longer had a forest to hunt in. He didn't turn on the lights, he didn't need to. He knew every inch of the floorboards that didn't creak in the exact weight of the air when the ventilation kicked in. For 23 years, he had been the Ghost of Seoul, a name whispered in backrooms and high-rise boardrooms by men who paid millions to make their problems disappear. Now, he was just a man in a dark room, surrounded by the expensive silence of a retirement he hadn't asked for, but had earned in blood. On a sleek mahogany desk sat the only remnants of his former life, a disassembled custom-built handgun, its parts laid out on a microfiber cloth with surgical symmetry. Cleaning the weapon was a ritual, a form of meditation that kept the tremors of a restless soul at bay. His reflection in the window showed a man who looked younger than his 45 years but carried a 1,000-yard stare that suggested he had seen the end of the world more than once. His life was governed by a strict, cold discipline, 4 a.m. workouts, meals weighed to the gram, and a total absence of human connection. To the few neighbors who saw him in the elevator, he was a quiet tech consultant or a wealthy investor. They didn't see the tactical vest hanging in the hidden closet or the scar that ran like a jagged lightning bolt from his collarbone to his ribs. He had convinced himself that this isolation was peace. He told himself that the world was better off if the ghost stayed dead. He lived by a simple rule: never look back, and never let anyone in. Empathy was a luxury he had burned away long ago in the furnaces of his training. He was a weapon that had been put back in its case, locked away to gather dust. But as the city lights twinkled outside, indifferent to the monster living among them, a low vibration broke the stillness. It was a sound that shouldn't have happened. His private phone, a device encrypted and scrubbed of all ties, buzzed on the desk. He didn't move for a full 5 seconds, his sharp, tired eyes tracking the blue glow of the screen. In his world, a late-night message meant a contract or a threat. He expected a code, a location, or a death sentence. Instead, the screen displayed a string of digits he didn't recognize and a sentence that bypassed his tactical mind and struck directly at the Michael Rodriguez he used to be, 25 years ago. The silence of the tomb was gone, replaced by the ghost of a child's voice. The elevator descended in a blur of brushed steel and silence, but Taeyang's mind was already miles away, dissecting the few clues he had. He stared at the glowing screen of his phone, rereading Jerry's descriptions. The boy had mentioned a strange, sweet smell in the room, like cherries or old candy, and that his father had complained of a sudden, splitting headache before his legs simply gave out. To a layman, it sounded like a stroke or a heart attack. To a man who had spent 2 decades studying the chemistry of quiet endings, it was a signature. The scent of bitter almonds was the telltale calling card of the alchemist, a specialized chemist for the pharmaceutical syndicate Taeyang had once protected. This wasn't a random medical emergency, it was a professional hit using a synthetic cyanide derivative designed to bypass standard autopsies. The realization turned Taeyang's blood to ice. Wells Lincoln wasn't just a father, he was a target, and the poison was a clock that had already begun its final countdown. The mission was no longer just a response to a wrong number, it was a collision with the world Taeyang had tried to bury. He knew the protocol for this specific toxin. The victim would appear to be sleeping, their respiratory system slowly paralyzing until the heart simply forgot how to beat. He reached into his tactical bag, his fingers brushing the cold glass of the pressurized injector. Inside was the Blue Widow, a rare, experimental antagonist he had stolen during his final job. It was the only thing on the planet that could restart a nervous system seized by the alchemist's work. As he stepped out into the subterranean chill of the parking garage, the roar of his high-performance engine echoed like a war cry. He checked the GPS coordinates Jerry had sent, a modest apartment in a district currently being redeveloped by the same syndicate. The irony was a bitter pill. He had likely shared drinks with the men who ordered this kill. He might have even trained the person who delivered it. This was personal now. Every second he spent idling was a second the toxin moved deeper into Wells Lincoln's brain. But more than that, it was a second the cleanup crew got closer to the apartment. In the syndicate's world, they didn't just leave bodies, they erased witnesses. And Jerry, with his shaking hands and his father's phone, was the ultimate witness. Taeyang shifted the car into gear, the tires screaming against the concrete as he launched himself into the night. He wasn't just racing against death, he was racing against the very monster he used to see in the mirror. The tires of the black sedan screamed against the asphalt as Taeyang tore out of the parking garage, the vehicle's nose dipping as it lurched into the neon-drenched veins of the city. To any onlooker, it was a blur of mechanical aggression, but inside the cockpit, Taeyang was a study in cold, mathematical focus. He wasn't just driving, he was calculating trajectories, traffic patterns, and the exact second the stoplights would cycle. Every red light was a suggestion he ignored, weaving through the late-night traffic with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. He knew the syndicate's cleanup protocols. They would arrive exactly 15 minutes after the toxin was administered to ensure the target was incapacitated but the body was still warm enough to manipulate into a natural death pose. His phone sat mounted on the dashboard, the screen glowing with a map that pulsed like a dying heart. A new notification appeared, a single, trembling sentence from Jerry. Someone is knocking on the door. They said they're the police, but they don't have a siren. Taeyang's jaw tightened, his knuckles widening against the leather steering wheel. The cleanup crew was early. They were testing the door, likely prepared to pick the lock or use a master key provided by the redevelopment firm. "Don't open it, Jerry," he muttered under his breath, though he knew the boy couldn't hear him. The heavy steel door of the stairwell yielded without a sound, a testament to Taeyang's ghost-like movement. The hallway of the fourth floor smelled of damp concrete and cheap floor wax, but as he approached apartment 4B, the air changed. It was there, the cloying, artificial sweetness of bitter almonds, a chemical scent that signaled the presence of death. Outside the door, two men in identical charcoal suits stood with the rigid posture of military-grade security. One held a set of master keys, the other had his hand hovering near the small of his back. They were the cleanup crew, the syndicate's erasers. Taeyang didn't give them the chance to speak or draw. He moved with a violent, fluid efficiency that defied his years in retirement. A palm strike to the first man's throat was followed by a sweeping kick that sent the second into the drywall with a muffled thud. Within 5 seconds, both lay unconscious and dragged into the shadows of the alcove. Taeyang took the master key, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt since his father's final night. He turned the lock and stepped inside. The apartment was a stark contrast to the violence in the hall. It was filled with the clutter of a life built on love, plastic dinosaurs on the rug, a half-finished drawing of a superhero on the coffee table. In the center of the small bedroom, the scene was frozen in time. Wells Lincoln lay sprawled across the bed, his face a haunting shade of gray, his breathing so shallow it barely stirred the air. And there was Jerry. The boy was smaller than he looked in the photos, a fragile figure huddled on the edge of the mattress. He was clutching his father's limp, cold hand with both of his own, his knuckles white. Tears had carved clean streaks through the dust on his cheeks. When the door opened, Jerry flinched, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it made Taeyang's own soul ache. The boy's phone was still clutched in his lap, the screen displaying their brief conversation. "Are you the one?" Jerry whispered, his voice cracking. "Did you come to wake him up?" Taeyang stood in the doorway, a lethal figure draped in tactical gear and the scent of gunpowder, looking entirely out of place in a child's sanctuary. For a moment, he saw himself in that boy, the same desperation, the same silent prayer for a miracle. He lowered his gaze, his sharp features softening as he knelt at the bedside. He didn't look at the boy with the cold eyes of a hitman. He looked at him with the heavy heart of a man trying to fix the world. "I'm here, Jerry," Taeyang said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Stay with him. Just a little longer." He reached into his vest for the Blue Widow injector, the glass vial catching the dim light of a bedside lamp. The cleaners were down, but the poison was still winning. The real battle was just beginning. The silence of the apartment was a fragile veil, and Taeyang knew it was about to tear. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots at the far end of the corridor, the rest of the team. The syndicate never sent just 2 men for a high-profile erasure. They were coming to finish what the poison had started, and they wouldn't leave a child as a loose end. Taeyang turned to Jerry, his expression masked in a calm he didn't truly feel. Jerry, listen to me very carefully. I need you to play a game. It's called The Fortress. You have to put these on. He reached into his tactical pouch and pulled out a pair of noise-canceling ear protection, compact, sleek, and absolute. He fitted them over the boy's small ears and adjusted the headband. I need you to close your eyes and count to 100 while holding your dad's hand. Don't open them, and don't let go, no matter what. Can you do that for me? Jerry looked at the black gear covering his ears, then back at Taeyang. He nodded slowly, his small fingers tightening around his father's cold palm. As the boy squeezed his eyes shut, the transformation in Taeyang was instantaneous. The warmth left his gaze, replaced by the mathematical lethality of the ghost. He stepped back into the hallway, closing the bedroom door to a tiny crack. 3 shadows rounded the corner, silhouettes against the dim emergency lights. They were armed with suppressed submachine guns, moving in a staggered diamond formation. Taeyang didn't wait for them to reach the door. He became the shadow itself. He moved with a terrifying, silent fluidity. He didn't use his firearm. The sound of a struggle, even muffled, was a vibration he didn't want Jerry to feel through the floor. He intercepted the lead man in the darkness of the narrow kitchen. With a clinical twist of the wrist, he disarmed him and used the man's own momentum to drive him into the granite counter. Before the second man could pivot, Taeyang was behind him, a blur of motion. A precise strike to the temple sent the man crumbling to the linoleum. The final assassin leveled his weapon, but Taeyang was already inside his guard. He redirected the barrel toward the ceiling and delivered a devastating series of blows, short, brutal, and silent. The hallway returned to its tomb-like stillness in less than 20 seconds. 4 professionals lay neutralized, hidden in the dark recesses of the living room and kitchen. Taeyang paused, breathing shallowly, listening. No more footsteps. He wiped a smudge of red from his knuckle and straightened his vest. He took a single breath to steady his pulse before pushing the bedroom door open. Inside, the world was still. Jerry was still there, eyes squeezed shut, lips moving silently as he counted. He was still holding his father's hand, a tiny anchor in a sea of darkness. Taeyang knelt beside them, the monster hidden once more. He gently tapped Jerry's shoulder. The boy opened his eyes, the silence of the headphones still shielding him from the reality of the war that had just unfolded inches away. I'm still here, Jerry, Taeyang whispered. And now, it's time to bring him back. Taeyang's hands remained steady, a stark contrast to the storm of adrenaline surging through his veins. He looked at Wells Lincoln, whose skin had taken on the translucent, waxy sheen of a cooling corpse. The man's chest barely moved, the intercostal muscles were failing, paralyzed by the synthetic neurotoxin. Taeyang knew that in minutes, the lungs would cease their expansion entirely, and the heart would stop out of sheer exhaustion. He reached for the pressurized injector, the Blue Widow antidote shimmering with a deep, unnatural cobalt hue inside its glass chamber. This was a substance never meant for public hands, a high-level antagonist developed in the same shadows Taeyang had once called home. He cleared the air from the needle with a sharp, clinical flick. He didn't need a vein. The Blue Widow was designed for intraosseous or deep muscle penetration to bypass a failing circulatory system. Jerry, keep holding his hand, Taeyang commanded softly. He needs to know you're there. He positioned the injector against Wells' lateral thigh, pressing the safety seal firmly into the fabric of his trousers. Taeyang took a breath, his thumb hovering over the trigger. This was the moment of no return. If the dosage was off, or if the toxin had already crossed the blood-brain barrier in too high a concentration, the antidote would cause a violent, final seizure. Click. The mechanical hiss of the injector echoed in the small room. Taeyang watched the blue liquid vanish into the muscle. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the reaction began. Wells' body arched off the mattress, his spine stiffening as the antagonist hit his nervous system like a lightning strike. Jerry let out a muffled gasp, his eyes widening behind the noise-canceling headphones, but he didn't let go. He squeezed his father's hand harder, his small knuckles turning white. "Stay with us, Wells," Taeyang hissed through gritted teeth, his hand pressing down on the man's shoulder to keep him from rolling off the bed. "Fight it." The monitors of the man's own body were invisible, but Taeyang could see the war playing out under the skin. A flush of color began to creep back into Wells' neck. The gray pallor receded, replaced by a raw, painful-looking pink. Then came the sound, a ragged, wet gasp as Wells' lungs suddenly rediscovered how to pull in oxygen. It was the sound of a man being dragged back from the edge of an abyss. Taeyang checked the pulse at the carotid. It was erratic, thumping like a trapped bird, but it was strong. The Blue Widow had held. The Ghost of Seoul slumped back slightly, the heavy weight of the tactical vest suddenly feeling twice as heavy. He looked at Jerry, who was staring at his father's heaving chest with a mixture of terror and dawning hope. Taeyang reached out and gently removed the headphones. "He's breathing, Jerry," Taeyang whispered, the coldness in his voice finally beginning to thaw. "He's coming back." But as the immediate medical crisis passed, the reality of the situation returned. The hallway was full of unconscious assassins, and the syndicate would soon realize their cleanup crew had gone dark. The heavy, rhythmic sound of Wells Lincoln's breathing was the only thing that mattered in the small, shadowed room. Each inhale was a jagged victory over the poison, a mechanical triumph that slowly began to smooth out into a natural cadence. Taeyang watched the man's eyelids flicker. It was a movement he had seen 1,000 times in his previous life, the moment a target regained consciousness. But today, the stakes weren't a contract or a secret. They were the wide, hopeful eyes of the boy standing beside him. Wells groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated with the effort of returning from the void. His eyes snapped open, unfocused and bloodshot, darting around the room in a panic until they landed on the one thing that could ground him. "Jerry," he rasped, the word barely a whisper, his voice shredded by the paralysis and the antidote's violent restart. "Daddy." The cry that broke from Jerry was a mix of a sob and a laugh. He didn't wait for Taeyang's permission. He threw his small arms around his father's neck, burying his face in the man's shoulder. The weight of the world, which had been resting solely on Jerry's narrow shoulders for the last hour, finally seemed to lift. Taeyang stood back, moving into the deeper shadows of the corner. He watched as Wells' trembling hand rose to stroke the boy's hair, the father's instinct overriding the confusion of his own near-death experience. "I'm here, son," Wells managed, his eyes finally clearing as they drifted over the top of Jerry's head to find Taeyang. There was a moment of silent communication between the two men, one who had been marked for death and the one who lived in it. Wells saw the tactical gear, the cold precision in Taeyang's stance, and the discarded injector on the floor. He didn't know who this stranger was, but he knew the smell of the room and the men he had been fighting against in his work as a whistleblower. He understood that a miracle had walked through his door wearing a Kevlar vest. Taeyang checked his watch. The silence in the hallway wouldn't last forever. The syndicate would have GPS trackers on their cleanup crew, and soon, a much larger, more desperate wave of violence would descend on this apartment. He had restored the boy's hope, but now he had to ensure that hope wasn't snuffed out in a hail of gunfire. "You need to move," Taeyang said, his voice regaining its professional edge. "Your son saved your life tonight, Wells." He reached out when no one else was listening. "But the people who did this, they aren't finished." He looked at Jerry, whose tear-streaked face was glowing with a radiant, pure relief that Taeyang hadn't seen since he was a child himself. The hitman felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest, a sense of completion. He had kept his word. He had stayed with him. Now, he had to make sure they disappeared. 6 months later, the city of Seoul breathed with its usual frantic energy, but for Taeyang, the air felt different. He stood on a high pedestrian bridge, his rugged features partially obscured by the collar of a dark coat. Below him, in a small, sun-drenched neighborhood park, a young boy let out a jubilant shout as he kicked a soccer ball across the grass. Jerry looked healthy, his cheeks full and his laughter bright, a stark contrast to the trembling child who had once clutched a dying man's hand in the dark. Watching from the sidelines was Wells Lincoln. He moved with a slight stiffness, a lingering ghost of the toxin that had nearly claimed him, but he was alive. He had followed Taeyang's cryptic instructions that night, disappearing into a federal protection program with the evidence that eventually dismantled the pharmaceutical syndicate. To the world, Wells and Jerry were just another family starting over. To Taeyang, they were the living proof that his hands could do more than just destroy. Taeyang reached into his pocket and felt the familiar weight of his phone. It no longer received coordinates for targets or alerts for offshore accounts. He had liquidated his empire, funneled his blood money into anonymous trust funds for children like Jerry, and retreated into a true, quiet retirement. The Ghost of Seoul was finally at rest, but in his place stood a guardian. He didn't need their thanks, and he didn't need them to know his name. The sight of Jerry's unfiltered joy was the only currency that mattered. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the park, Taeyang turned away. For the first time in 25 years, the memory of his father and his sister didn't bring a sharp, stabbing pain. Instead, there was a sense of settled debt. He had walked through the fire and brought someone back with him. He moved back into the flow of the city, a man among millions. He was still a creature of the shadows, and his past would always be a part of him, but the internal war had ended. A wrong number had led him to the right path, proving that even the most broken weapon could be forged into a shield. Taeyang disappeared into the evening mist, a silent protector leaving the light to those who deserved it most. The midnight message had been answered, and finally, the hitman was at peace.